Who is God? He's the absolute authority. He determines what is good. He determines what is right. He determines what is bad. He determines what is just.
Ken, many people look at the fossil record and they see that as evidence for godless evolution. But you say that the fossil record is actually evidence of Noah's flood. Why do you say that?
Well, you don't look at the fossils and see evolution. You see dead things, right? That's what you see.
Right.
And actually, all over the earth, we see dead things. In fact, there are billions of dead things. If Noah's flood was true, you'd expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And you know what you find? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. See, to make a fossil is a catastrophic event. I mean, if you go home and your pet cat just died, sorry about that, but I don't like cats. And you said, I don't want to lose my cat. I want to turn it into a fossil. If you put it on your front yard and put a sign there, dead cat fossilizing, do not touch, scientific experiment in progress, it is not going to fossilize. It'll decay, other animals eat it. I mean, when a deer dies in the woods in the summer, 2 weeks, and there's hardly anything left at all. How do you make a fossil? You've got to cover something catastrophically. On this earth, we have billions and billions and billions of fossils in layers thousands of feet thick. You have to have an awful lot of water, an awful lot of mud, which sounds like what? The flood. And see, what the evolutionists say is those fossils were laid down millions of years before man. And by the way, many of those fossils show evidence of diseases like cancer and abscesses and arthritis. Remember, after God created man, he said everything was very good. So you can't add the millions of years into the Bible, because then you'd have God saying cancer is very good. So the fossils, according to the biblical history, had to come after man was created, had to come after sin, because it's sin that led to death and disease and a groaning world. And so it's the flood that makes sense of the fossils. And you don't see one kind of animal changing into another kind in the fossil record. You just find the kinds that are preserved. That's all you find.
And you can see that at the Creation Museum through the exhibits that are there. Ken, what are some of the exhibits in the Ark Encounter that answer some of those difficult questions? What are some of the questions that people have that they look at the exhibit and go, oh, that's how they did it. That's how Noah did this.
Questions like, how did Noah get the animals on the ark? I mean, how did they fit? How many were needed on the ark? Well, wait a minute. How did he look after them? How did he water them? How did they feed them? How did they get rid of waste and so on? And we have exhibits that deal with all of those questions on the ark and a lot more. We look at the flood in regard to climate change. As Noah and his family came off the ark, then we look at post-flood events like the Tower of Babel and the formation of different people groups, not races. We go through all of those. In fact, on deck one, when you walk into that, I mean, this is a life-size Noah's Ark. And on deck one, we particularly have there an exhibit with a cutaway model of the Ark, and we have signs there saying 1,398, animal kinds at the most were on Noah's Ark. Now, we think the real number is less than 1,000. And we list the animal kinds that were needed on the ark. And how do we find those? We did all the research for this, and we've got it in our Answers Research Journal, which is a free journal on the web. Take dogs. There's 34 species of dogs. And what our scientists are able to do is go and document that all those species are connected genetically. In other words, this species bred with this one with this one, this one with this one over here never bred with this one way over here, but they're still connected. And if they're all connected, then that means they're all of one kind. And when you do that, you find most animals are connected at the family level of classification. In other words, for dogs, Canidae, the family, we would say 2 of the dog family got on the ark. And the same for cats. So all your cat species today came from the 2 cats that were on the ark. All your dog species today come from the 2 dogs that were on the ark. And we explain all that in the exhibits.
That's right. So let me ask you about the water. If the mountains were covered with water because of a global flood, does that mean that there was enough water to cover Mount Everest? And if so, where did all the water go?
Okay, good question. That's one that we answer in the Ark exhibits as well. And it's one we get asked. I've been asked that a lot over the years. First of all, when you look at, say, the Himalayas, right? You have marine fossils on the top of the Himalayas. Wait a minute, marine fossils. How'd they get there? Well, if you were to level out the Earth's surface, so today you level out all the mountains and the ocean basins and make a smooth Earth, there's enough water to cover to a depth of 2 miles. In other words, there's plenty of water on Earth right now to cover the entire Earth. So how do fossils get on the top of the Himalayas and other mountain ranges around the world? Here's what we would say: at the end of the flood, God raised up the mountains and lowered the ocean basins. In fact, one of the Psalms, it seems to even talk about that in Psalm 104. God raised the mountains, lowered the ocean basins, so the water poured off the earth to where it is. And when you look at these mountain ranges, you see where they've been uplifted. So the mountains obviously weren't as high and the ocean basins not as deep before the flood. And so if you want to know where's the water from the flood, it's covering the earth right now, right? 75% of the earth is covered in water. 3/4 of the earth is covered in water. The water poured off. And you can see that, for instance, if you take the Grand Canyon, that whole area was uplifted because when you go up on the Kaibab Plateau, you're going up. You know, if you're in Arizona there in Phoenix and you want to go up to the Grand Canyon, you have to go up because the whole area is lifted up. And there are all these fractures that occurred in the rocks because of that. So the fossil layers were laid down and that area was uplifted. And as it was uplifted and caused all this fracturing, it also caused a dam. And you can see where there were once gigantic lakes there that were formed by that dam. And then because the material was soft and was fractured by the uplift, then the water broke through the dam and gouged it out. And actually, if you go downstream from the Grand Canyon, you can see where the sediment was deposited in massive layers as it was gouged out of the Grand Canyon. And so when we start to think about the flood model and how it occurred and what happened at the end of the flood, we also believe there was one continent before the flood, and that continent split up at the end of the flood, all part of, you know, building the mountain ranges and so on, and then the water pouring off the earth.
Ken, how do we think about a loving God flooding the earth where all these people died, including women and children, not just a few really bad guys?
Well, let me ask you a question first, okay? For someone who's an atheist, says there's no God, and he says, well, your God's unjust if he did that. Wait a minute. How does an atheist decide what is just and what is not just? How do they determine what is right and what's wrong? By what standard? By whose standard? And that's what we have to first of all ask ourselves, and that is, who is God? He's the absolute authority. He determines what is good. He determines what is right. He determines what is bad. He determines what is just. I mean, if we do that ourselves, then it's all subjective and it's all relative. So why should somebody else have the same right and wrong as us? So when somebody accuses God, for instance, an atheist will accuse God of being unjust, they can't do that because how can they take their own subjective standard and moral relativism and try to force that on somebody else? We've got to understand from the perspective is God is the creator and he's the just God. And he judges sin. He's also a God who judges, and he judges sin and he judges wickedness. So what does the Bible say about the people at the time of the flood? He says every thought of their heart was evil continually. And so God has every right to judge those people because of their wickedness. And we have no right to judge God because of who he is.
What about people who struggle with the idea that all of the diversity within the human race could have come just from Noah and his family? That there would be many more abnormalities, there would have been way too many problems, and we never could have the diversity that we have today in the world. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, Kirk, can you think how big 10 to the 80th power is? A 1 followed by 80 zeros. None of us can even think that big. A 1 followed by 80 zeros. Do you realize that's the estimate of the number of atoms in the whole universe? You know how big the universe is. 10 to the 80th power atoms. If you took one man and one woman right now, from their DNA and the information in their DNA, how many children could they potentially have without having the same combination of information? 10 to the 2017th power. I mean, compared to the number of atoms in the universe, 10 to the 80th power. In other words, here's what we've got to remember. God put incredible potential, genetically, genetic diversity in the dog kind, the cat kind, the elephant kind, and so on. So when the dog kind came off the ark, over time, depending on which mated with which, and they split up and so on, you get different species. In the human kind, when the event of the Tower of Babel occurred and God gave different languages about 150 years after the flood, people split up and move away from each other. And depending on who marries who dies out, we get certain features. They only represent minor genetics, really, on the outside, darker skin, lighter skin, because we've all got the same skin color. It's a pigment called melanin. But we see all these differences that are there. In fact, you look at 8 billion people today, we all look different from each other. That's because of all that information that's there. In other words, because God put an incredible amount of diversity in our DNA, and because of the event of the Tower of Babel forming different people groups, that's why we see distinguishing features of certain groups. But because of all that information, we see incredible variability. It's basically unlimited in the human kind. And that's where those differences come from. You mentioned one thing, though, that's very important to understand. And that is, because of sin, there are now mutations. And so what about, wouldn't people have died out because of all the problems from genetics and so on? But because of the amount of diversity that God has put there, and because sin has caused a problem, that's why at the time of Moses, God said no longer could close relatives marry. Because as sin caused all these problems building up, if close relations marry today, bad genes can get together. But because of the incredible diversity God put in our DNA, if the further away in relationship you are, the more likely you've got a bad gene, it can be overridden by a good gene that masks it.
Thanks for watching my interview with Ken Ham, founder of Answers in Genesis, the Creation Museum, and the Ark Encounter. Don't want to miss future conversations? Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel.